Hello, my name is Martin Belov, and I'm professor in Constitutional and Comparative Constitutional Law at the University of Sofia, St. Clement Ohridsky Faculty of Law. I'm also Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law, and it is my great pleasure and honor also to be with you this actually late evening. I'm leading one of the strands of this valuable project, which is called EU Values and Social Challenges. And this is a project which is part of the Summit project that is itself part of the National Resilience and Recovery Fund. So we are very grateful to the European Union and the Bulgarian government, but especially to the University of Sofia for giving us this chance to do European science on world level here at the University of Sofia. So today we are going to talk about the challenges to representative democracy, not so much about its past, more about its present and probably its future. But before starting to talk with my colleague and friend, Dr. Sasha Hart, I just would like to say a few words about the strand that I'm leading, because the whole project leader is Professor Maria Stojceva, and I have a separate strand in that project. So as part of this strand, I have designed, and now we are implementing 3 strands. The conversation series, which is common for all the 3 strands, but also 2 specific lecture series, one devoted to rule of law and democracy in times of crisis and emergency, and the other one devoted to constitutional imaginaries, imaginaries about the past, the future, imaginaries of fear, and so on and so forth. So we are trying to invite the best scholars from Europe and abroad, actually, to participate in our lecture series. And Sasha himself was actually part of it. He delivered a beautiful lecture just last Monday. Also, as part of my strand, there are 3 conferences. The first of them just took place yesterday. It was devoted to representative democracy in crisis. So we tried to give some new narratives on representative democracy. We spoke about the imaginaries of representation, the representative democracy in times of crisis and emergency, and then to the different challenges that stem from the technocratic tendencies we witness nowadays, tendencies towards global algorithmic technocracy, tendencies towards juristocracy and global judicial empire. A few words about our distinguished guest this afternoon. Sasha Hart, or just Sasha, is actually a great internationally recognized scholar, although a young one. He's teaching a lot of challenging and interesting things at the University of Maastricht in Netherlands, related mostly to constitutional and comparative constitutional law, but also to constitutional law in context, for example, law in society, and European law as well. But also Sasha has many international projects, so he teaches also in Indonesia, and from time to time in Austria as well. And now he had even the chance to teach in Bulgaria, which is not so frequent. So we are also very glad that as a part of this project, we can attract leading scholars as Sasha to work for us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Great. I'm glad that you still share that opinion. The talk is still not finished.
Absolutely. All the more so now.
Okay. So today I will play the role of asking questions mostly. And then just would like maybe to give a short outline of our talk today. We'll start with a short definition of what representative democracy means, and then we'll continue towards the bunch of challenges to representative democracy. Mostly we'll focus on one of these groups, namely the technocratic challenges to representative democracy, and then we will end up with an attempt at optimism. I have to admit, probably doomed. How can we democratize democracy? Is it possible? Is it thinkable to use more immediate forms of democratic participation, self-identification, and representation? Or to put it in the words of a German scholar who wrote a book or edited a book like 20 years ago, Klaus Offe, Demokratisierung der Demokratie. Can we democratize democracy? So that's I'm done with talking in a monolithic way, so my question to Sasha is, can you briefly introduce the concept of representative democracy to our audience?
Well, briefly, I'm not sure, but let us start with the words or the views on representation of political scientist Hannah Pitkin, who defined it as a three-dimensional object in a dark enclosure, and whenever you switch the light on, you only ever see one aspect of it, and depending on the vantage point from which you look at representation, you will always see a different aspect. So it's very contextual. And she gives a definition of 4 different aspects of representation, and in representative democracy you will usually have a mixture of them. Those aspects are formalistic, or formal representation. You are a representative if you have been brought into that position using the correct procedure. You have been duly elected, the elections have been fair and legal, and so on. Or symbolic representation, the way in which kings represent nations, or the way in which also semiotically symbols represent peoples. Descriptive representation, I'm a representative of a constituency or a polity or a group of people if I am in substance like them. So I could be a representative of people who share characteristics of my identity. And finally, she speaks about substantive representation. So I am representative as a parliamentarian, for example, if I'm able to speak on behalf of somebody and in their interest. So I wouldn't necessarily have to be like the represented, but be able to speak in their interest. And when we talk about representative democracy or representation in liberal democracies, we usually think silently a mixture of these things, right? Representatives in the sense of elected office holders, parliamentarians, will have to be formalistically representative. They will also have to be substantively representative because they need to speak in the interest of their constituents. But then the debates start. For example, in many parliaments, the question is the composition of the parliament really representative of the people if it only contains a certain percentage, usually, unfortunately, a lower percentage of women, for example, or certain age groups, or people with disabilities, and so on. So there is no consensus on when exactly a representative body is representative and what type of representation we need to call it representative. And I think that there is movement in views on this. So I believe that in the present day, there is a movement towards more calls for descriptive representation. So people from more strands of society, people from more types of identities, gender equality, of course, is a typical one, and away from the vision of substantive representation being possible without that. So this is in flux.
Yep. Let me ask you a few questions about that. First of all, would you define one of these forms of representation as a predominant one? And if there is a predominant form, is it dysfunctionality the cause for the current tendency towards crisis? And second, don't you have the feeling that we are kind of returning to identitarian representation that actually existed in pre-modern times, because we know that representative democracy was part of what Günther Frankenberg calls constitutional magic and deceit, right? It was a very interesting creative mixture between two concepts which are actually antipodic and very different. Representation, which was sacral, sacred, monarchical, aristocratic concept, and democracy, which was actually utopia and part of something which we call invented tradition, right? So they were married happily for, let's say, depending on how optimistic you are, 100 or 200 years, more or less depending on the country. And then we see the dismantling of this marriage, which leads us to both two tendencies. First of all, the rise of identitarian populist representation, and then the trend towards technocracy and oligarchic, technocratic, paternalistic forms of governance.
Yes. I think you're very right there. this marriage, as you call it, the joint venture of democracy and representation in the liberal democratic state had certainly a strong focus on representation in the substantive sense. Of course, people had to be brought into place according to the correct procedure, and of course there were also always some undertones of representation having to be descriptive. Society should be mirrored in a way. But this is getting stronger, and I think this has to do with a decrease in reputation of representation.
That's actually a very mild term, in my opinion, very diplomatic one.
It might be. So there are various phenomena that we see happening at the same time contribute to this. So the idea that representation used to be a vehicle to bring the interests of, well, all relevant groups in society, or all groups in society as inclusively as possible, into the picture when making policy decisions, is being replaced by the idea that representation is an obstacle that stands in the way of communication between the citizen, the individual, and government, and taking decisions in a more direct form. Right? This has, I think, to an extent, this is mediated by technology, because technology gives us the impression, and I think it is often only the impression. Of course, certain technological ways are there in which individuals from all walks of life can, at a very low cost, reach a large audience, but it is still mediated by algorithms, by commercial interests, and of course also by political actors who steer this. But in principle, the technological possibility for individuals to speak directly to power and participate in power, and thereby also exercise power themselves, is now more present than it used to be. And that gives the impression that representation is often an obstacle to political majorities, for example, to implement their will more directly in a cruder, populist version of democracy, which emphasizes the will of the majority over other components that the liberal states attaches to the democratic system: protection of minorities, protection of fundamental rights, due procedure, and the rule of law. This gives the impression that we are hindering the direct implementation of the will of the people.
You're emphasizing correctly one of the visible side effects of the current dismantling of what I call three marriages, which were constitutive marriages for not only constitutional law, but for political modernity. This was the marriage between representation and democracy that I have just mentioned, the marriage between liberalism and democracy, right? Because they are not necessarily a coupled phenomenon, right? So they were intertwined with the huge efforts of a range of political scientists and constitutional scholars. And then the most important marriage, the marriage between capitalism and democracy, because actually democracy was to an extent a side effect as the whole constitutional civilization of modern capitalism, right? So before capitalism there was no democracy, and it is very unfortunate that there are signs that now capitalism starts realizing that it can do also without democracy, right? So I usually feel like a kid of three groups of parents, and they're all divorcing at the moment, right? So, and there are two evil children, two evil twins that were produced out of these massive divorce. Populist identitarian kid, but also there is a technocratic kid, which is not so much discussed in science.
That is, I think that is a correct assessment. There are now examples of capitalism functioning rather well without democracy, certainly without liberalism in democracy. Yes, I think these evil kids are so far developing rather successfully in the world, and for a proponent of the liberal project, these are worrying developments.
And what will happen if liberalism is fully detached from democracy? Can we have not necessarily a liberal democracy, but democracy that is not liberal in the traditional sense?
Well, there are those who do argue that illiberal democracy is a contradiction in terms, because it takes away the safeguards that liberalism contains for the continuation of democracy. There are also those, of course, who argue that illiberal democracy should absolutely be possible, focusing on the majoritarian popular sovereignty element. If there is a majority in favor of an illiberal political content, why should this not be implemented? Probably we will see something like a middle ground. I myself am rather skeptical of illiberal democracy being a long-term functional
Are you optimistic
concept.
about liberal democracy?
About saving it?
Yeah. Because there was a political scholar, I'm not sure, but I think it was Ivan Krstev, who said that liberalism is a little bit like the software for handies. You have to permanently upload the new version. And yeah.
At the moment, I don't think we can be too optimistic. We can see in some polities that illiberal turns are not irreversible, right? If we, or at least, well, time will tell, but we will see that, we are seeing that, for example, in Poland, elections can be won even after a couple of years of government by proponents of, I think, what we can call an illiberal democratic system. But by and large, I do believe that illiberal tendencies take away safeguards to such an extent that authoritarianism, if not part of the program, at least becomes, at least gets an entryway, and at least becomes more likely.
And which are actually the main challenges to contemporary representative democracy?
I think the biggest challenge is a mixture of a technical one and a reputational one, and they have to do with each other. Once representation is no longer perceived as a necessity, as the only way to get interests of societal groups, of individuals, of various political strands that operate in society and that live in society, in order to bring them into a functional government, representation has a crisis of reputation. That has to do, as I said earlier, with technology, but it also, once such systems become operational, for example, by having experiments experiments or systems of direct democracy implanted into systems of representative democracy as we know them from the long 20th century. Yeah. We will get the effect, and I can give you an example of this, we will get the effect that direct democracy, which of course produces a strong sense of legitimacy for majority decisions, can undermine political decisions taken in the representative fashion. I'm working and teaching in the Netherlands. There we had a system between, I believe, 2014 and 2018, a political device of direct democracy called the corrective consultative referendum. It would work like this. You would have a political decision or a legislative decision, so taken by Parliament, by the elected representatives. They would make a law, and the law would have been approved. In the Netherlands, this means having received royal assent, so the law is made and done and effective. And at that point in time, the people, having collected sufficient signatures, as this works, popular initiatives, could force a referendum on the subject of this legislation, which is already made. The referendum would be held, and if the referendum, which essentially boils down the legislation to a yes or no approval or disapproval question, could be challenged. It's consultative, which means formally speaking it is not binding, and it's corrective because it's ex post facto, the law has already been made. But of course, being a referendum, being the direct, supposedly direct voice of the people, it would create, it would come with a great sense of legitimacy, whatever the result is. Mm-hmm. Now, in several examples, a famous one being the referendum on the association agreement between the European Union and Ukraine, the result of the referendum was negative. So there had already been legislation approving this association agreement, which was not even between the Netherlands and Ukraine, but between the European Union and Ukraine. It received a negative result in a referendum, and of course, while not being binding, politicians had a very hard time and ultimately also didn't defend this law against even a non-binding referendum. So you have, on the one hand, a representative system which supposedly and constitutionally speaking creates legitimacy for political legislative decisions, and then you have next to that a direct democracy device which also comes with a high degree of legitimacy. It comes with problems. It boils down complex questions to a simple yes and no. It is susceptible to campaigning, which can be, well, campaigns do not always strictly stick to the subject matter. They can be, for example, turn referendums into plebiscites on agreement or disagreement with the local government, etc.
So do we really have a feasible alternative to representative democracy? Because, you know, that's a very challenging question, because representative democracy is the only form of democracy we ever had. Before representative democracy, there was autocratic monarchical governance or some self-governance of some remote town meetings or alpine cantons, but generally this is the only democracy we know, and it's a representative party democracy. And if there is no alternative, and if it's in crisis, do we have kind of trajectory that we can look upon in the democratic future, or the future looks rather post-democratic?
Well, I don't think that electoral representative democracy is really the only form or the only mechanism of democracy that we know. Most systems know methods, mechanisms of popular participation or deliberation that exist within existing representative systems, right?
But
is it, you know, if we want to scale this up to really replace also on a national or even European level this representative system, I do not think that it is feasible as such. Yeah. So my favorite example in the European Union, for example, would be where, of course, as you know, a lot of very technocratic decisions are also being taken, and not necessarily in a full representative fashion, right?
At least not in a democratically representative fashion.
Not even that. It's well, often closer to technocracy. There is a control function, of course. We have the European representative organ, the European Parliament. We have national parliaments controlling their own government's contribution. But, of course, there are technocratic decisions taken. But let's imagine a system in which we replace that representative function by direct decision-making by people. There are obstacles of scale.
Of course. No, it's obviously an utopian vision, but, you know, I have the feeling that we are swimming in a sea of human rights and feel less and less empowered. The same way we are swimming in a sea of democracy, we are talking about not only the traditional variants or either alternatives or addendum to representative democracy, such as deliberative, participatory, or direct democracy, but now what is really fashionable is constitutional crowdsourcing, yes, opinion polls, and stuff like that. And still we feel less and less democratically empowered. So the feeling is that we have much more formal, procedural, institutional democratic opportunities, both representative and direct, and we feel less and less democratically represented.
Yes, and various things happen because of this. One is the shifting of decision-making away from classic political decision-making bodies to judicial instances. So the judicialization of large-scale societal problems such as climate change, for example, potentially also migration, from being resolved or ultimately decided on by representative decision-making bodies, parliaments, to judicial bodies. That is one of them. The others are what we already talked about, calls for more direct democracy, or also, so far still rather experimental forms, citizen councils, crowdsourcing like they tried in Iceland.
No, because I have the feeling that we're heading towards not only post-democracy, but also what I call global algorithmic technocracy and judicial empire. So we have these two strands of technocratic governance, administrative and judicial, but also the factors of global governance that actually create less and less favorable context for representative democracy. But since we promised our audience to say a few words about the technological challenges to representative democracy, can you, as a conclusion, say a few words about which are the main challenges stemming from the IT revolution and digitalization, algorithmic constitutionalism to representative democracy?
Well, I believe this becomes more and more visible, and not primarily even in the member states of the European Union or even North America, but in those countries where, on the one hand, the usage of technology is extremely high. The BRIC countries, for example, countries like India, also Indonesia, Brazil, and so on. And on the other hand, the political and media literacy is still on a somewhat lower level, but which also tend to have younger populations and an altogether different climate when it comes to the use of technology. Here we see, and in the West or in European Union member states, this is we're going towards this as well, that social media becomes one of the, if not the only source of information and channel of political communication for many, which wouldn't in itself be a problem if it hadn't internal working mechanisms that make it more difficult and less likely to reach consensus and to reach positive outcomes in the interest of the common good by way of consensus. Why? Because the algorithms that steer the communication and that decide what you get to see are not free of interest, right? You get to see what you like to see, and your political opponent does the same. So this is the classic narrative of the filter bubble, which isn't much of a problem as long as it serves entertainment purposes. But if this becomes increasingly the only source of information, the only channel of political communication, it does have the effect of undermining what Cass Sunstein has formulated as prerequisites for a functioning democracy. The one is you need to have regular, even involuntary encounters with the political other to realize that there are other visions on what political decisions to take. And second, a shared experience of reality. People they can disagree about everything, but they should at least agree on what problems we're facing.
That's quite difficult in the, I would say, postmodern and post-truth society. Yes. You have raised many issues like filter bubbles, micro-targeting, which we have to save for another talk. So thank you very much, Sasha, for discussing these topical issues.
Maybe I can add to come to a speck of optimism in this. We do see.
Be my guest.
We do see that we are not completely powerless. It can be shown, for example, and this is absolutely not a solution, but it is a sign in which direction things would have to go, that regulation can have an effect. That, for example, in systems or environments where it is generally harder to obtain all the data, the personal data necessary to effectively micro-target at a very low cost, which doesn't say it's not possible, but it's more expensive to micro-target, it tends to happen less. So data protection is important. We also see that environments in which media literacy is higher, media diversity remains higher. It's decreasing in many places, but where it is still present, this has a positive outlook. So we do have an idea of where to go. Education, safeguarding media diversity by various, including regulatory means, are tools that help. And, you know, people are resilient, and technologies are new and they're developing fast, and regulation is typically a little bit slower. But people also develop over time. So
wonderful. We have to have one optimist among us.
I don't think it's completely hopeless. I wouldn't call myself necessarily an optimist, but you know, somebody who curiously observes. So.
Great, great. Thank you very much again, and stay tuned for the next lectures as part of this great project, and also be invited to our conferences and other lecture series. We will advertise them through the social media, using them for good, powering the optimism of Sasha. Thank you very much, and goodbye from me.
Thank you very much.